Hi, and welcome to my video discussing the strategic relevance of deterrence in the cyber domain. Thomas Rid famously stated in 2013 that cyber war will not take place. Lucas Kello has since refuted the argument by outlining that cyber warfare takes place in a completely new domain in which old parameters of war might no longer be valid. The use of the word deterrence indicates that the international relations community has begun to interrogate the cyber domain in a strategic manner and to acknowledge cyber tools as an additional form of political warfare. Deterrence was a defining and successful feature of the nuclear era, but deterrence as we know it from the Cold War era cannot be copied and pasted and applied to the cyber domain. Operations in the cyber domain are more complex and more nuanced in terms of the ends to be achieved, the actors involved, and the instruments employed. The cyber domain is a transnational, global, open space that transcends conventional ideas of geographic space, physicality, sovereignty, and authority. This exacerbates the challenge of both regulation and deterrence. The key attributes of the cyber domain are simultaneously strategic vulnerabilities that render the formulation of a deterrence strategy very challenging. Number one, anonymity. This allows both the identity and the location of cyber actors to be obscured. Number two, global connectivity. Information can be produced, exchanged, and shared almost instantly, anytime and anywhere. Combined with anonymity, this creates significant problems in terms of identification of the offender and therefore attribution. Number three, increased accessibility and affordability. Barriers to entry in the cyber domain are low, hence broadening the number of actors. While during the nuclear age, the protagonists were states and the antagonism was state to state. In the cyber domain, the actors are states, non-state actors, and surrogates, all of which adds to the complexity of identifying the end offender and attributing an attack. The relative cost to the offender is often disproportionately low. Surrogates, which could be private individuals or corporations acting at the behest of a state or state intelligence services, exacerbate the problem of attribution. Timing is also a critical factor in deterrence, and its implications are twofold. Number one, cyber attacks, or the manifestation of malware, code, worms, typically occur real-time. But discovering the source of the attack, identifying the perpetrator, and attributing the attack to that source with evidence takes time. How feasible is it to retaliate in response to a cyber attack several months, years after it occurred? The speed of technological innovation leaves little time for strategic adaptation, while in the nuclear age, the gap between new technological advancements and strategic adaptation took years. In the cyber age, strategists must respond almost immediately to new technological developments. In Western liberal democracies, deterrence in the cyber domain is frustrated further by the fact that critical infrastructure is rarely owned or controlled by state institutions, but are often operated cooperatively and managed between the state and the market. This is in contrast to authoritarian countries such as Russia or China, which tend to have control over critical infrastructure or de facto control via state-owned enterprises. But for all of these challenges to deterrence, the development of a credible deterrence program for the cyber domain is critical, as we are undeniably living in a cyber age. So what determines a credible deterrence program? Numerous factors determine the credibility of a program. Firstly, does the potential aggressor believe that a defender will implement its deterrence program in the event that it is attacked? Deterrent policies are often viewed from the perspective of the entity doing the deterring, but the value of the deterrence program depends entirely on its effect on the perceptions of the target state. A strategy to prevent aggression must begin with an assessment of the interests, motives, and imperatives of the potential aggressor, including its theory of deterrence, what it values, and why? As noted by Michael Mazar, deterrence is much more than merely threatening a potential adversary. It demands the nuanced shaping of perceptions so that an adversary sees the alternatives to aggression as more attractive than war. So is it possible to deter potential aggressors by denial? Arguably, this is impossible to achieve in the cyber domain, as it would require absolutely secure systems and networks, which currently do not exist. This does not mean that constantly shoring up defensive capabilities of networks should not happen, but it does mean that, while aggressors continue to probe weaknesses, they will inevitably eventually penetrate systems in some form. This leads us to consider deterrence by punishment, which could be effective for large states such as the US, where they could use the threat of withdrawing aid or imposing economic sanctions as levers that could restrict the offensive use of cyber capability by economically dependent states. We can conclude that the aggressor is incentivized to attack unless deterrence by denial is overlaid with a credible regime of punishment. Deterrence by denial must be matched with deterrence by punishment in order to make the deterrence regime more robust. But deterrence doesn't necessarily have to involve always punitive measures. Given the complexity of developing an effective deterrence program for the cyber domain, all aspects must be considered, including offering positive inducements to states that commit to a non-proliferation of cyber attacks, for example. A further and important aspect of deterrence noted by Joseph Nye is that of entanglement. This is particularly relevant in relation to China. If China, or indeed another aggressor, knows that it will hurt its own economic or commercial interests by hurting its target, this entanglement acts as an inherent form of self-deterrent. The growing interconnectedness of the US and Chinese economies, for example, would make strategic warfare very costly to both sides. This question is part of a bigger issue of whether China is incentivized to upend the existing liberal world order as its power grows. I would argue that as long as China feels that the stakes are too high for it to do so, because China has too much skin in the game within the existing world order, there is no reason for it to do so. And the same can be said of China in relation to the cyber domain. How important is resilience to a successful deterrence program? We've acknowledged that systems can never be absolutely secure. However, they can be built resiliently to endure cyber attacks without failing. Hence, resilience can deprive aggressors of the incentive to launch cyber attacks. If it is clear that an attack will have little impact on a target, why bother? The final aspect of a successful deterrence strategy must be the development and establishment of multilateral agreed norms in the form of an international cyber code of conduct. This is an essential ingredient towards the formulation of an effective deterrence program in relation to the cyber domain. These norms could then be formalized into an international legal format within the context of the UN Charter. This would allow for potential legal action against states acting outside of the acceptable boundaries of behavior, and this could act as a deterrent. Nothing currently prevents states from using cyber power offensively to secure national interests. The use of offensive cyber power has not been defined as an act of aggression in the eyes of the law. Hence, for the US, for example, to have responded to the alleged Russian interference with anything stronger than an economic or diplomatic retaliation would not have been deemed a proportionate response to the interference in the US election. As cyber attacks grow, NATO has a clear incentive to strengthen its capacity to deter and punish cyber attacks, including through conventional kinetic responses. NATO policymakers acknowledge cyber warfare as a distinct sphere of conflict, but to date, there is not a bespoke deterrence policy in relation to the cyber domain. By failing to define the rules of engagement for retaliation, NATO exposes itself to potential chaos in the cyber domain in moments when its members will inevitably have to respond to a cyber attack, while simultaneously exposing its members to adversaries who will likely continue to push the boundaries of tolerance, acceptability, and norms. Bringing the power of acceptable norms and taboos into the realm of the cyber domain will likely also be an important part of a deterrence regime, as we see currently in relation to areas such as chemical and biological weapons. Even with a comprehensive deterrence regime in place, encompassing all of the components we have examined here, defenders will continue to face challenges from potential aggressors who may resort to salami tactics. By salami tactics, we mean only ever escalating cyber attacks in small increments without ever reaching a threshold of cyber war. Aggressors will constantly resort to testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior and the resolve of deterrence programs. They could use a long series of low-level aggression in the cyber domain to change facts on the ground, without ever escalating to a point of action that would justify a major retaliatory response by the defender. And this provides the opportunity for aggressors to achieve objectives gradually and incrementally. These salami tactics are perfect for the cyber domain as they confront the defender with a dilemma. They cannot escalate rapidly in response to a small transgression in the cyber domain. However, if they fail to punish incrementally increasing minor transgressions, the strategic position of the defender will eventually erode and ultimately runs the risk of having the credibility of its deterrence regime completely undermined. In conclusion, we can say that the anonymity with which cyber warriors operate and the degree of deniability that state actors can often plausibly declare make it almost impossible to devise an effective and credible deterrence strategy. But it would be a mistake not to seek to define a comprehensive strategic deterrence policy, and it would be complacent to assume that just because the use of cyber technology so far has been less destructive in the physical domain than conventional kinetic uses of force, the offensive use of cyber capability will always remain under a particular threshold defined as a cyber peace. We should take note of Lucas Kello's comment that never before has the international contest for security in the absence of war so imperiled nations and drained their intellectual, industrial, and political resources as in the cyber age. We must acknowledge that the speed of technological development makes it challenging for strategists and policymakers to be ahead of the curve, and that potential aggressors are likely to find ways to continually test the robustness of deterrence programs and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This ultimately means that a deterrence program will never be complete. It must instead be an ever-evolving living organism that responds to emerging threats as they become apparent. Thank you.